Okay, back again on this day before Easter. And we are moving into part six here, and we're going to talk about different theoretical perspectives in medical anthropology. Okay, so we're going to have three of them. We're going to have three perspectives in medical anthropology, and want to get myself out of the way here. Okay. Magenta. We'll stick with magenta. All right, so three theoretical perspectives. So what I want to do first is just list them all up here, and then we'll get into some depth on each one. So the first one is going to be called the ecological epidemiological approach. The second one is going to be called the interpretivist approach, and the third one is going to be called critical medical anthropology. Now, a couple of things to say about these before we even go on is, not arguing whether any one of these is the best or which one is right or anything like that. I think they all make a certain amount of sense. I think the one that you would choose would depend on what your purposes are. Okay. And in this part here, in part six, we're going to talk about the first two, ecological epidemiological approach and the interpretivist approach. And then we're going to save for part seven. It's going to have its own part on critical medical anthropology because that is going to take the most time, I think, to talk about. Okay, so you got these three perspectives here, and just before we go on, we'll just make one statement about each one and give you a kind of an overview about what each one is about. So the first one, the ecological epidemiological approach, it has the word ecology in it, so you might guess that it has something to do with the environment. So the epidemiological approach argues that the environment is important, right, in shaping health problems. Okay, and that's going to be particularly important when we get to, talking later on about applied medical anthropology. The second one is the interpretivist approach, and it focuses on symbols and meaning, right? Interpretation. It tries to interpret cultural health systems, understanding them, understanding any cultural health system, including the Western biomedical model, understanding it as a system of meaning, okay? And then the third one is this critical medical anthropology that is, you might guess, critical of the Western biomedical model. Primarily wants to get the Western biomedical model to pay more attention to things like structural factors, right? Structural suffering and all those kinds of things. And so it looks at Western biomedicine as a cultural institution within Western society and offers a critical examination of it. Okay. So it goes along with the idea that we said before, that Western biomedicine has done very wonderful things, but has its shortcomings and problems. There's some issues in it that maybe need to be addressed. Okay. All right. So where are we going to start? Well, we're going to start at the top. And so we go to the ecological epidemiological approach, which is talking about this relationship between cultural health systems and the environment. Okay. So its main premise, right, is that the natural environment interacts with culture, and this interaction of the environment and culture is one of the things that causes health problems. So that its research, right, the research that it's going to undertake should gather or should focus on gathering information about the environmental context in which people live, and how various social patterns and social practices affect health. Okay. And so it's looking for, right, findings, it's seeking findings that are relevant to public health programs. So it's essentially an approach to medical anthropology looking at this relationship between the environment and culture and cultural practices in order to inform different kinds of public health programs. So one of the examples that Barbara Miller gives you is the example of hookworm in China. Okay, so I just wanted to read to you what she said, and again, once again, I have, let me get this book here. I have this version of the book. Okay, and I'm on page 104. And on page 104, Barbara Miller says, the ecological epidemiological approach seeks to yield findings relevant to public health programs. It can provide information about groups that are at risk of specific problems. For example, although hookworm is common throughout rural China, epidemiological researchers learned that rice cultivators have the highest rates. The reason is that hookworm spreads through night soil, human excrement used as fertilizer, that is applied to the rice fields in which the cultivators work. Okay, so you have a problem of hookworm in rural China, right? And primarily among rice cultivators in certain parts of China. And why? Because they have a traditional practice of using night soil as a fertilizer. And there's not anything necessarily wrong with that. But hookworm is a parasite. It's an intestinal parasite. Excuse me. It enters through the skin. The organism that creates this hookworm in the intestine lays its eggs in excrement. Okay. And so what? Well, having this knowledge about this connection and this practice, this agricultural practice, the result of it was a sort of a rural public health program to do a few different things, right? To improve sanitation, to improve the cleanliness of water, to improve latrine practices. Okay, so they went to they were investing money into building in these rural communities, building latrines that actually were built in such a way that the larvae or the eggs, I should say, of this hookworm would be killed in the process. And that's something that Miller doesn't really tell you about. She tells you about how the anthropologist found out about the hookworm and stuff and why, but she doesn't really tell you about, well, then what happened? And what happened was, with that knowledge, a public health program was instituted to combat hookworm in Chinese rural communities. Okay, so there you go. So that's a very important aspect of this ecological approach. Okay. All right. What else? Well, the urban is also an environment. So urbanization is an environment that affects health. Settled versus unsettled life, right? Rural stressors, for example, that affect health, like overcrowding and so on. Okay. Conditions that create this extra multi-drug resistant tuberculosis and so on. So we're not only looking at the rural environment, but also the urban environment. Okay, not only the natural environment, but the built environment. Okay, all of that is of concern to the ecological epidemiological approach. What else? Well, social conditions like colonialism, right, and its relationship to impaired health of indigenous people. You had a little bit of an example of that with, sort of the thing that Jared Diamond talked about when he talked about crowd diseases. And then we get this very important thing, the colonial legacy. So, that's an environment too. The colonial legacy leads to something called historical trauma. So historical trauma is a very important concept. And what historical trauma is referring to is the intergenerational transfer of emotional and psychological effects of colonialism from parents to children. And that it's the transfer of these effects that lead to different kinds of health problems among indigenous people, among indigenous communities. So, in other words, what historical trauma is talking about is how these factors from the past can explain the social and the spatial, geographic distribution of contemporary health problems, right? So, for example, the colonial legacy, right? Historical trauma, and let's say high rates of alcoholism among Native Americans. One way that these anthropologists would understand the high rates of alcoholism among Native Americans would be through this concept of historical trauma. And there's actually a pretty wide literature on that. Okay. So this whole idea that factors from the past, if we look at, again, you look at the example of Native Americans, it's European contact, it's genocidal war, it's resettlement, it's life on reservations. All those things accumulate as historical trauma and lead to various kinds of health problems. Okay, so I have here, this is a picture depicting the Trail of Tears, okay, which was the resettlement of Cherokee people from Georgia to Oklahoma in the 1800s, and many people died on the way. And this is just one example, one event, right, within the whole history of traumatic events that affected Native American people. So it's just my little representation of historical trauma. Okay. So that's the ecological, epidemiological approach. Now we get to the interpretivist approach. Okay? So here we go. So the interpretivist approach is based on the assumption that health systems are systems of meaning. Okay? Health systems are systems of meaning. Very good. What does that mean? Well, it's interested in how people in their cultural context label, describe, and experience illness. So remember, in the very beginning, we talked about that disease-illness dichotomy, and that illness had to do with how people collectively, right, how they experience illness, how they experience a disease, and what kind of symbolic meaning, right, do they attribute to it. Okay? So the interpretivist approach is much more concerned with that kind of thing. Okay, how do people label? How do people categorize? How do people symbolize illness? Okay. So when we talk about healing systems, one of the things that healing systems do, any healing system, right, whether we're talking about community healing or humoral healing or the Western biomedical model, it doesn't matter. Any healing system offers people meaningful responses, right, to both individual and communal distress. What's happening to us must have meaning. Okay, what's happening to us must have meaning. And so there was an anthropologist named Claude Lévi-Strauss, right? He's a very famous anthropologist, and he did a lot of work on ritual dances, those like healing dances, for example, that we saw and we talked about when we talked about the Kung. And he said that when he was talking about these ritual dances, he said that healing systems provide meaning for people who are experiencing seemingly meaningless suffering. I said that what is happening to us must have meaning, right? We have a need, right, to understand why we're going through what we're going through. Okay. And health and healing systems provide people with the symbols, right, to understand what they're undergoing, what's happening to them. Okay. So, meaning, get myself out of the way here. Meaning provides psychological support, right? Meaning provides psychological support and may enhance healing through the placebo or the meaning effect, right? Which is actually a symbolic, right? It's a non-material factor, right? That accounts for healing, all right? So, I said earlier, that communal healing systems, the reason they work to the extent that they work is because of this, right? It's all about those communal healing systems, like the dances that the Kung do. Even we saw the healing service, the healing ritual of the Pentecostal Christians in the Ozarks, right? All of that is about providing psychological support for people, and what that does is enhances healing, right, through this meaning effect, through that placebo effect. Okay, and one of the examples I like to talk about when I get to this is my old neighbor, Marina. Okay, if I can see that. No, it was the other way. She lived out that way. She lived to the house the other side of me. And she was she's gone now. God love her. And she was a nice old lady, very good old lady. And some years ago, she contracted breast cancer. She had some breast cancer. She was very, very scared. And I talked to her about it. She was telling me how scared she was and everything. And she was undergoing some chemotherapy for her breast cancer. And this went on for a while. And then, one day I was walking Zombie, and I came around the corner, me and Zombie, and she saw me coming around the corner, and she came running out of the house. And she was so excited. She said, Dan, I went to the doctor today, and guess what? I said, what, Marina? She said, my cancer is gone. And I said, oh, that's great, Marina. And she said, yeah, I've been putting holy water on it every day, right? And, that, to me, is a good example of what we mean by this meaning effect, okay? Now, what cured her? Was it the radiation? Was it the chemotherapy, or was it the holy water? Well, maybe it was a bit of both. Maybe it was a combination of both. It was probably mostly the chemotherapy, right? But in her mind, what gave her what gave her experiences of this illness meaning was her religion. And what gave her, maybe a frame of mind, right, to be able to undergo what she had to undergo to get cured, was religion. And her spirit, her beliefs, and her spirituality. And so I'm not saying that the holy water, in any sense, cured her directly, but it was symbolic of something that made her feel better, right? And put her in a frame of mind that was more amenable, maybe, to being healed. Exactly right? Exactly what people who do research on the placebo effect talk about. Okay, so that's the interpretivist approach. Okay, so where are we now? Well, I think we're at the end of this. We're at the end of this little part, and the next part that we're going to go into is going to be this critical medical anthropology. So we'll see you very soon. Okay, come back for part 8. Yeah, I think it's part 8. All right. Okay, y'all. Take care now.